When surrounded by 45,000 Germans with no escape, the American commander didn't order his men to pray for rescue. He ordered them to attack. At 11:30 in the morning on December 22, 1944, 4 German officers approached the American lines outside Bastogne in Belgium, carrying a white flag. They brought a formal surrender ultimatum from the commander of the 47th Panzer Corps. The message was direct because the American position seemed hopeless. They were surrounded by 7 German divisions with no chance of relief and limited ammunition. So the Germans offered them a choice: to surrender with honor or face total annihilation by artillery. The ultimatum was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, who was acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division. McAuliffe had been napping when his staff woke him with the demand. He read it, looked at his officers, and said just one word, which was nuts. His staff thought this was just a reaction, but McAuliffe insisted it was the official reply. The response was typed up, and Colonel Joseph Harper delivered it personally to the Germans. When the confused German officers asked what the word meant, Harper explained that in plain English it meant the same as "go to hell." That one-word response captured something fundamental about American military doctrine that had been developing for more than 2 decades. It represented a philosophy that made American forces fight differently than any other army in the Second World War. When surrounded, most armies defended and waited for rescue, but Americans counterattacked. This difference was the result of deliberate choices made by leaders who studied the First World War and determined they would never fight that way again. The transformation began in 1939, on the day Germany invaded Poland. That same day, General George Marshall was sworn in as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. President Roosevelt had passed over 33 senior generals to select Marshall, which shocked the military establishment. Marshall inherited an army that ranked 17th in the world, with fewer than 200,000 soldiers scattered globally. Equipment dated from the First World War and training was minimal. The army resembled a constabulary force rather than a combat organization. But Marshall had seen modern war firsthand in France during the previous World War. He had watched American units take massive casualties in frontal attacks and seen officers fail because they could not adapt to changing conditions. He witnessed the consequences of rigid command structures that could not respond to tactical realities. Marshall understood that the next war would be more mobile and deadly. American forces needed a doctrine that emphasized flexibility and aggressive action rather than adherence to obsolete plans. The foundation for this had been laid years earlier at Fort Benning, where Marshall served as assistant commandant of the infantry school. During those years, he revolutionized how the Army trained its officers. 200 future generals passed through Benning during Marshall's tenure, including Omar Bradley and Matthew Ridgway. Marshall stripped away complex formal problems and replaced them with practical exercises focused on making rapid decisions with incomplete information. He told instructors that officers needed to learn how to think rather than what to think. He emphasized that in combat there would never be perfect information or enough time. Officers had to be trained to act decisively despite uncertainty. Traditional education emphasized waiting for orders, but Marshall taught the opposite. He wanted officers who would take initiative without waiting for permission. His tactical philosophy centered on offensive action because he believed the best defense was a good offense. When a unit was attacked, the immediate response should be to counterattack without waiting to assess the whole situation. You identify where the enemy is and assault their position before they can consolidate. This was based on his analysis that German forces were most vulnerable immediately after they attacked, when they were disorganized. If Americans counterattacked immediately, they could retake lost positions. But if they waited, the Germans would establish defenses that would cost dearly to break. Marshall also changed how officers were evaluated. Students who could quote manuals received high marks in the old system. But Marshall emphasized practical execution. Students who made sound decisions under pressure received high marks even if they ignored regulations. This shift from procedural knowledge to practical judgment meant officers were trained to think. By the late 1930s, officer training across the Army emphasized initiative and aggressive action. Marshall eliminated lengthy lectures and replaced them with field exercises where officers solved problems under time pressure.
When Marshall became Chief of Staff, he began implementing these principles across the entire Army. He knew the United States would be drawn into the war, and that American forces were unprepared. His first priority was promoting officers who shared his vision of mobile warfare. He was ruthless in removing officers who could not adapt, forcing more than 600 into retirement before combat began. He replaced them with men like George Patton, who believed in speed, and Dwight Eisenhower, who understood complex operations. Marshall's second priority was training the millions of new soldiers. In 1940 and 41, the Army conducted massive exercises called the Louisiana Maneuvers, involving nearly 500,000 soldiers. Marshall watched carefully to test his concepts. The maneuvers confirmed that units moving aggressively performed better than those that waited for orders. Junior officers who took initiative achieved better results. Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton distinguished themselves during these exercises by using armored units to strike deep into rear areas. Although logistics and communications often failed, the fundamental tactical concepts proved sound. Aggressive offensive action and decentralized decision-making worked. By December 1941, the Army had grown to over 1 million soldiers trained in this aggressive doctrine. This was codified in Field Manual 100-5, which stated that offense was the decisive form of combat. Defense was only temporary. This was fundamentally different from Allied doctrine. The British Army had perfected defensive tactics, where they would hold ground and wait for reserves to organize a deliberate counterattack. This approach took days. The French similarly emphasized defense in depth and methodical operations. Soviet doctrine relied on overwhelming mass and centralized control. American doctrine was unique because it emphasized immediate action by the forces in contact. If a position was threatened, the local commander was expected to counterattack immediately with whatever was available. You did not wait for orders or perfect information. This required a different kind of soldier. Training focused on creating soldiers who understood the commander's intent and could adapt. Recruits learned battle drills that emphasized aggressive action, like reacting to ambush by assaulting through it. They learned there was no time to wait for perfect conditions. Officer Candidate School compressed years of education into 3 months of constant evaluation under pressure. Instructors created scenarios with no perfect solutions to force young officers to make decisions with incomplete information. This produced a culture where junior leaders were expected to show initiative. A lieutenant who saw an opportunity was expected to take it without asking permission. Marshall reinforced this by promoting those who took risks and relieving those who waited for orders. The first real test came in North Africa at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in 1943. German armor attacked and drove inexperienced American units back 50 miles. The situation looked desperate, with heavy casualties and broken cohesion. British commanders expected the Americans to pull back and rest for weeks to reorganize. That is what British doctrine dictated. But American forces did not wait. Within 24 hours, artillery units were back in action supporting infantry counterattacks. By February 22nd, American counterattacks stopped the German advance. The aggressive doctrine was working. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy, this culture was deeply embedded. This brings us to the German Ardennes offensive in December 1944. German forces launched a massive surprise attack with 30 divisions and 1,000 tanks. They advanced rapidly through thinly held American positions, creating a deep bulge in the front. If they reached the port of Antwerp, they could split the Allied armies. But three things happened that the Germans did not expect. First, small American units immediately mounted local counterattacks. At crossroads and villages, surrounded forces did not retreat, they attacked, which forced German units to slow down and deploy for combat. The cumulative effect of these small actions disrupted the German timetable. Second, American commanders organized large-scale counterattacks without waiting for the situation to clear. General Eisenhower moved entire divisions toward the breakthrough not to defend, but to attack. At a meeting in Verdun, Eisenhower told his commanders to view the situation as an opportunity to destroy the Germans in the open. He asked General Patton how soon the Third Army could attack. Patton said 48 hours. The room went silent because turning an entire army 90 degrees to attack a flank was considered tactically impossible. It required moving hundreds of thousands of men and vehicles. But Patton had already ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans. When Eisenhower gave the order, Patton's staff simply executed the plan they had prepared. Junior officers worked through the night to move units and reroute supplies without waiting to be told exactly what to do. This was exactly what Marshall's training was designed to produce. On December 22nd, 3 divisions of Patton's army attacked north into the German flank.
The defense of Bastogne itself demonstrated this doctrine in action. The town was a critical road hub, surrounded by 45,000 Germans. Conventional wisdom said to establish a defensive perimeter and wait. The Americans did the opposite and attacked. Throughout the siege, they conducted continuous offensive operations. They raided German artillery positions and hunted down infiltrators. When German infantry penetrated the lines near the village of Marvy, Team O'Hara immediately counterattacked with tanks and armored infantry. They did not wait for orders or to assess German strength. They drove the Germans back in close quarters fighting. Similar actions occurred around the entire perimeter. Every commander understood that when attacked, the response was immediate counterattack. Artillery support was also aggressive. Batteries fired heavily and often at danger-close range to their own troops to stop attacks. The all-black 969th Field Artillery Battalion provided critical fire support, often making independent targeting decisions. Tank commanders conducted aggressive patrols rather than sitting in static positions. This mobile defense worked because soldiers at all levels were trained to think offensively. A private on a machine gun looked for ways to attack, and a sergeant organized patrols. When the German surrender demand arrived, McAuliffe's reply of "nuts" was consistent with this spirit. They were not thinking about survival, but about killing Germans. The siege was lifted on December 26th when Patton's forces broke through. But the fighting did not stop there, as American forces immediately transitioned to the offense. The 101st Airborne began attacking outward the very next day. German commanders were stunned that soldiers who had just survived a desperate siege could immediately attack. The answer was that they had been trained that offense was the default and rest only came after the enemy was destroyed. This pattern repeated throughout the Battle of the Bulge. American units would fall back while counterattacking, reorganize quickly, and resume the offensive. There was no long pause for planning. British forces in the north operated differently, establishing strong defenses and waiting for clear assessments before launching deliberate counterattacks. Both approaches worked, but the American approach was faster. By late January, the Bulge was eliminated. The Germans suffered up to 100,000 casualties and lost equipment they could not replace. The Wehrmacht in the West never recovered. The tactical principles that won the battle were the same ones Marshall taught at Fort Benning. Take initiative, act with incomplete information, and maintain offensive action. Post-war analysis confirmed that aggressive, continuous action achieved objectives faster and with lower cumulative casualties. These lessons became embedded in American military culture. Modern training still emphasizes making decisions quickly rather than waiting for perfect knowledge. What happened at Bastogne was not a lucky break. It was the result of 20 years of doctrinal development. The difference between American and Allied approaches came down to a basic question of what to do when under attack. British doctrine said to defend and wait for preparation. Soviet doctrine said to mass, overwhelming force. American doctrine said to counterattack immediately with whatever you have. In mobile warfare, speed often mattered more than perfect preparation. German commanders consistently noted that American forces were the hardest to fight because they never stopped attacking. When you defeated an American unit, they immediately counterattacked, and when you tried to rest, they kept the pressure on. This operational approach was possible because of industrial might, a large population, and a training system that produced independent thinking soldiers. Marshall designed a doctrine to exploit these advantages. General McAuliffe always said his famous response came naturally because the Germans expected Americans to think about surrender, while the Americans were thinking about how to kill more Germans. General Patton's relief of Bastogne became a legendary case study in operational agility. But the most enduring contribution was Marshall's tactical doctrine. The principles are simple: seize the initiative, counterattack immediately, and empower junior leaders to act. Speed and aggression can overcome superior numbers. These principles saved Bastogne and contributed significantly to the Allied victory in Europe. Innovation happens not just through technology, but through clear thinking about how to fight and training systems that instill that doctrine at every level. If you found this account meaningful, please like this video to help us share more essential history.